So I'm happy I'm leaving the floor to Eleanor, and here it is to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessandra, for that introduction, and thank you everyone to be here for that presentation. I hope I will be clear and it will interest you. And I'm very glad to speak today about the subject I'm trying to specialize for years now, which is basically how to manage the increasing complexity of marine space, which is a quite tough subject, but super interesting subject. And today we will speak of the example of fishing management in the natural marine park of the Gulf of Lion, located in France, that I will present you a little bit later. So this subject roots in the huge common story between seas and oceans and humanity. As you know, that seas and oceans provide ecosystem function and services to humanity, such as regulating climate and sustaining the human activities, such as vessel transportation, renewable energy, but also the increasing of tourism, with more or less 1/3 of the population today living along the coasts. So new questions arise, and especially how to share the space and the resources between everyone. With this increasing multiplication of uses and users, they would like to have an access to that space and resources. And the problem is that with this multiplication of use, we have also more and more pressure on the ecosystems and a progressive degradation of ecosystem that lead us to ask how to protect them by faced to that multiplication of users and the multiplication of stakeholders. Because if we don't do that, and if we don't do that quickly, there could be a total loss of the services and functions that they deliver to humanity. So we have to think together to find some trade-offs, some agreement to protect at each scale, from international scale to local scale, both the space and resources, which is a super interesting subject. So to try to answer to that questions, we are more or less at the end of a century of common thinking, with the development of new science, such as new fishery science, the flourishing of international convention, and also the emergence of new concepts such as sustainability and socio-ecosystemic management, which are quite new, because about socio-ecosystemic management, we speak about a concept that appears in 1970, so it's quite recent. So the idea behind is to link the different components of science, social science, ecological science, economical science, and to insist that a good management will be a management that take into account all the relationships between the components. And human should be at the center of the reflection, because it is a disturbance unit, and it is also the first management lever. Basically, if we would like to protect the environment, we need to manage our own. Sorry, Alessandra, there is a problem. Okay. They need to manage our own activities before we could be. We are the first resource on the marine environment, basically. So to help us to answer that question, there is a development also of tools, like the creation of the International Court for the Right of the Sea, and also some tools that I think you know pretty well, such as the Marine Protected Areas Network, and more recently, the Marine Spatial Planning. So these tools were created to support some goals appearing from international convention, such as this goal that I think everyone knows, the 30 by 30, so to protect 30% of oceans and seas with marine protected areas in 2030, which is a goal that we don't really know now how to reach them. So we have to think together about how reaching that goal. So when we talk about the two tools, Marine Protected Areas Network and Marine Spatial Planning, in fact, there is two different tools that are closely linked, that sometimes overlapped, but are quite different. But the thing that is important is that there are similar goals. First, protecting the environment. Secondly, promoting the development of sustainable human activities, especially when we talk about blue growth. And the third one was to include stakeholders from each activities in the decision process. Because something new in the socio-ecosystemic management is that we try to find a common agreement with all the stakeholders. And it's not only having top-down approach, so some decision from the state that will cascade till the people, but also to make emerge some bottom-up approach from people to the states. And this is also especially developing because this approach needs a huge amount of data and to acquire quickly lots of data. And we discover that people have a very important knowledge that they can give to scientists to make things improving, I would say. The other special need of these two tools was to create methodology to merge all that concept, all that data from different fields, ecological, sociological, and economical, to create tools available for managers and that can use for manage their own area, so which is a super subject of research. So one of the most common tools is mapping and modeling. So marine spatial policies are today mainly based on mapping and modeling. So when I speak about mapping, it was not only creating a map with the disposition of each activities, but it was also understanding in each layer the dynamic of the activities. So having really thorough understanding of each activities, and then comparing the different needs and the different repartition of activity to find some priorities with the different users, and also to find some agreements, some trade-off to protect the environment, basically. So me, in that super huge era about developing that common thinking of management, I was typically shaped by that way of thinking. I did a Bachelor of Science and a Master in marine ecosystem, marine ecology, basically. And my first focus was to protect and to create some survey protocol for engineered species. So basically, engineered species are species that create by themselves the ecosystem because they will complexify the marine environment and they will shelter all a community of species. So I worked mainly on deep sea corals before and on macroalgae. For the first 0 states, the first assessments inside the French marine protected areas. So basically I work on habitats mapping and habitats description of dynamics and surveys. So this work was clearly very interesting and give me the tools necessary to go further in marine spatial planning. For example, I learned statistics, mapping, data management. But when I work on that survey protocol, I realized that one of the main stressors on these habitats, on that species that create the ecosystem by themselves, are human activity. So little by little, I began to broaden my work by introducing human pressure to reach the socio-ecosystem management. And basically, I specialized myself on fisheries. So why fisheries? Because fisheries is today one of the direct stresses, which is one of the main stressors on the ecosystems. So basically, consider today that the most important direct stressors on the ecosystem is fishing. So I began to work on fisheries. I was an observer on board, also observer on small-scale fisheries. And little by little, I discovered that fisheries are more broadened than just professional fisheries. And I initiated a thesis on recreational fishing. And I'll explain you later. And then I do a postdoctorate that tried to mix all my previous experience to compare the incidence of recreational and professional fisheries on stocks and marine environment to try to find a common management of both fishing practices. So this work was really clearly interesting because it led me to very well known the marine protected areas landscape in France, because I move a lot between different marine protected areas and also different institutes a little bit everywhere inside of France. That let me have a good knowledge that what is marine protected areas and what are expected to manage activities inside that marine protected areas to protect, firstly, habitats. So we will now focus on fisheries. Again, fisheries is one of the most stressors in marine protected areas. And it's also a very interesting subject of research because when we are talking about how to protect the environment, and thinking together about how to sharing space and resources, fisheries is one of the best models. Because fisheries is not one type of fishing, but there is plenty of different types of fisheries that are sharing a common space. So basically, we can separate fisheries in two different main parts. The professional fisheries, which are quite well known and followed by different institutes, and the recreational fisheries. And basically, there is very few known in Europe about recreational fisheries, especially when I initiated my thesis in 2017, where there is only one national assessment was really partial, and there is lots of things to discover about these activities. So basically, what is recreational fishing? Recreational fishing is described and defined in French, such as every fishing activity where the product is intended for the exclusive consumption of the fisherman and his family, and may not be peddled, exhibited, or sold. So because of that definition, the use of the product will completely be different between recreational, what we call recreational, and professional. Professional is to be sold. Basically, that's the only difference in the definition. So recreational fishing, you can practice from boats, from the shore, by spear fishing, but also by shell collecting. And in my thesis, we focus on the two first activities, so offshore and shore fisheries, basically. So for a long time, no one cares about fisheries. No scientists, no manager, or very few scientists and managers. Basically, because the only concern we have about recreational fisheries is that there is plenty of anglers. So because there is plenty of anglers, it could be an impact on stock and environment, but we don't really know what type of impact there is. On the other side, this activity has a super huge socio-ecosystemic interest on mental health, but also on the local economy. They are super hard to assess, so there is some survey limits regarding these practices because the population is highly diverse and highly dispersed. So basically, we can't do as we do for professional fishing to put observer on board because they are so dispersed and very few are really on board that it's impossible to do a survey like that. So there is all protocol to develop. And also, because the stock are declining everywhere, we need to find really fast some management measure for fishing. And on recreational fishing, there is a huge lack of data, and it's not the priority to try to sample some data for that activities, especially because we have some preconceptions, and the preconception is that professional fishermen take more than recreational fishermen. So for centuries, recreational fishermen was non-managed or just by very lax policies everywhere in Europe. The thing changed a little bit after because as the stock is declining and as there is more and more regulation for professional fisheries, the professional fisher begin to say, okay, it's not a problem to participate to the survey, to regulate ourselves, but we would like to do that only if you take into account recreational fishermen. So professional fishermen push the manager and the scientist to begin to have an interest for recreational fishing. And when we begin to follow recreational fishing, we discover that it's not so anecdotal. For example, at the end, recreational fisheries are as old as professional fisheries. More than that, they are predominant and sometimes exclusive in freshwater, especially in the United States, where there is very strong lobbying for recreational fishermen. When we talk about numerous fishermen, we estimate in 2019 that there is 220 million practitioners worldwide of recreational fishing, including 8.7 million fishermen at sea in Europe. And they are present in 76% of the exclusive zone, which is basically worldwide because we miss data from some countries. And the first estimation of the total catch said that recreational fishing represents today 12% of the global catch. So it's not anecdotal at all. In fact, other studies even highlighted that more than 12%, we are around 4%, so recreational fishing represents 4% of total world catch. but it depends a lot regarding the species you consider, or even the area you consider. For example, in Bahamas, it can hit more than half of the catches, and for some stocks such as pollax, it can even represent half of the catches. So for certain stock in certain area, it's not anecdotal, and it could even have a similar impact as professional fisheries. Moreover, the idea we have about recreational fishermen is really far from the reality, because historians prove that the activity is consumer-oriented since the Second World War. So basically, the fishermen go to fish and keep their fish. So the impact is really higher than we first think. And even if there is all that proof, before 2018, the catches from the recreational fishermen were not taken into account in the common fishing policy. So basically, they don't need to declare the catches, and the catches were not taken into account in the stock assessments. And so when the quotas for professional fishermen were created, they don't take into account the quantity caught by recreational fishing. So this element, the fact that the anglers are numerous, the fact that the stock decline, the fact that there is more and more studies that prove that recreational fishing has an impact, make scientists and managers statues that it's super important to follow recreational fishing everywhere in the world and in Europe. There is also another reason why we have some interest about recreational fishermen, which is more a political, socio-political reason. It was basically that our evaluation of stocks in fishery science are based on indication coming from professional fishermen. So basically, there is observer on board that are analyzing the catches and evaluates the state of stock regarding professional catches. The problem is, because of international problematics, such as, for example, the Brexit, there is less and less cooperation between professional fishermen and scientists, and it is more and more difficult to have this stock evaluation. So basically, there is a very important scientific interest for the cooperation with recreational fishermen to see if it's possible to evaluate the state of stock using data from recreational fishing to complement the data that we have with professional fishing, or just to switch when it's not possible to have data from professional fishermen to use data from recreational fishermen for stock evaluation. And there is a strong cooperation possible with recreational fishermen, because when we spoke about marine spatial planning is to manage commonly the area and the resources, so there will be some restriction. And the fact that recreational fishing federation are not considered inside the marine spatial planning give them no right at the end, no possibility to be included in the reflection. So if there is something forbidden, they will be the first to be cancelled, I will say, from the access to the, they could have some access denied because they will not be taken into account in the reflection. So that's why Federation of Recreational Fishermen would like to participate to scientific studies to say, we are here, we have the right to access the water, basically. So all that things make that in 2018, for the first time, the European Union statutes that it's super important to follow, to monitor and to follow recreational fishing and to manage it. So it was more or less 1 year after the beginning of my thesis. So my thesis was called Socio-Ecological Approach to Shore and Offshore Recreational Fisheries in Support of Sustainable Coastal Areas Management. So it was a thesis that I did in the University of Perpignan-Viadomiccia under the direction of Marion Verdier-Jaraya and Philippe L'Enfant, and which was supported by basically the French government and the Marine Protected Areas Network, and also Fishing Federation and the Région Occitanie, which was the financer of the project. So my work in my thesis was to investigate possible management for recreational fishermen, for recreational fisheries, and also to give the keys to begin in the case of marine spatial planning, to compare the recreational fisheries and professional fisheries impacts on the socio-ecosystems, and to begin to find a common management trade-off to commonly manage the two activities. So I did that work in the Natural Marine Park of the Gulf of Lion. Why? Because it's the second largest park of the Mediterranean Sea, and there is no regulation for recreational fishing. And because it's an area where there is a strong population of recreational fishermen, but also a strong population of professional fishermen, especially small-scale fisheries. And for recreational fishing, it's totally open and multi-species, so there is really few limitations. And it's a highly touristic area, so we know that we are important fluxes of fishermen that come here without any obligation to declare the catches and without any way to know how many people arrive to catch. So basically, on the coast I'm working from I was working more or less 100 kilometers. We have no data at all about recreational fisheries. And because we have no data, there is no specific law, even if managing recreational fishing was one of the targets of that park. So the only limitation that they have was the minimum catch size, Mediterranean minimum catch size. So it was just that they cannot fish a fish under a certain size regarding different species. So the objective, I have three main objectives in my thesis. The first one was to evaluate the pressure exerted by recreational fishing. So basically, we need to know if we are in a context such as Bahamas, where the recreational fishing is half of the catches, or if something anecdotal and it's just 0.1% of catches, we really don't know. So there is two first steps on my thesis. Making an estimation of the total effort, how many fishermen are there, basically, and an estimation of their catches. So for that, we based all the analysis on interpolation for people who are doing statistics to assess the importance of recreational fishing in the area. When we have that, we think about how to manage it. So the second step of the thesis was to describe different management levels and try to rank the different levels to find the most sustainable management rules to protect the ecosystem from recreational fisheries. So for doing that, we created a mixed approach using linear general models and multi-regression trees and also random forest to try to rank this management measure. And as a metric, we use yields because the idea behind was to decrease yields, finding the management level that will decrease the most the yields, just to make less capture at the end. So that's the idea. But then when we have that management measure, the second thing that we need to do is, does the fisherman would like to apply that measure? And the other thing is, finally, will that measure really be efficient in the area? Because you can have a measure that will just touch 1% of the population, and other measure that will touch 90% of the population. But the idea is to touch how much people that possible, but to be effective. So it's not important to touch 90% of the population if only 1% of your population is responsible of 90% of the impacts. So basically, we try to touch the people who are the more responsible of the socio-ecosystemic impacts. So for doing that, we decided to describe the population of fishermen to know who is fishing and what are the different impacts of the different type of fishermen. So we analyzed the composition of the population, and we could describe 4 different types of fishermen. And for that 4 different types of fishermen, we analyzed their incidence in stock, their incidence on indicators, on socio-ecosystem, economical and siding effects. So for example, if they are collecting baits, so touch the low-level trophic jam, if they are anchoring and destroy the habitats or something like that. and also their relation with manager, to see if we put this regulation, if they will really apply them, or in the contrary, if we need some control to be sure that the regulation that we put in place will be really useful or not. So the goal at the end will be to propose some management measure for recreational fishing, and to have lots of data available to find some trade-off also with professional fishermen. So all that work will be based on source sampling. So basically, the first year of my thesis was just to sample some data. So I spent more or less 1 year on field, and I performed during 1 year more or less 5 outings per week. And for each outing, we make frequentation record. So basically, we count the number of fishermen along the coasts. We make interviews. So we go to ask questions with fishermen. So basically about what they are fishing, how they are fishing, who they are, where they are coming from, for example. So during 1 year, we performed 464 interviews, which is quite a huge database at the end. And the last thing that we do on field for each outing was biometric catch record. So basically, we analyze all the catches from fishermen. So we identify the species, we measure the species, we weigh the species, caught, the individual coats. So at the end, I think I measured 1,200 fish during that year, which is quite numerous also. So in 1 year, we spent 683 hours of in-situ observation on field. And we success to create one of the biggest databases on recreational fisheries of the Mediterranean Sea during that year of thesis. So regarding the result of the thesis, we have 5 main results that I will present you quickly. So the first one was that in the marine natural park of the Gulf of Lion, there is a real need to manage recreational fisheries, because recreational fisheries are unsustainable without regulation. So fishermen caught more than the quantity they can hit, basically. And they keep all their catches. So they don't respect the regulation, basically, to explain it like that. The only regulation that we have on minimum catch size is not respected. So we analyze that it represents more or less 70 tons caught per year, with 84% of the catches made from the boat. So between boat fishing and shore fishing, boat should be the first to be managed because of the quantity caught, basically. Even if there is some input also to manage on shore. The second result that we have is that we could rank the different management rivers, so we can find priorities of management. So especially on such species where the minimum catch size are not currently adapted to the area. So there is fish species, especially, which need to be managed. We could also find some spots where there is a real need from monitoring and awareness rising and even control. And we also made 2 different discoveries. The first one was the possibility to define total bag limits, so a quantity that fishermen could caught per outing to reach the sustainability. And this quantity was around 1.2 kilograms per outing. And this is interesting because it's 5 times less than the quantity today allowed in the natural marine park that implement total bag limits. So actually, the regulation implemented in the Mediterranean Sea regarding recreational fishing are just to avoid poaching, but are too laxist to have a real incidence on the state of stocks, basically. And then we find some area really interesting to create annual closure to protect some species or some state of life. And the things that was quite interesting is that the area really important for shore fishing and offshore fishing are different. And this is interesting because when we think about recreational fishing regulation today in the Mediterranean Sea, we only implement one regulation for all the activities. And we don't take into account the variability of practices inside the area. So often the regulation implemented are not sufficient to protect each state of life of the species. Regarding the composition of anglers, we define 4 different profiles, 4 different types of fishermen, with one which is more sensitive than the other because of the practices and the incidence on the socio-ecosystems. So the 4 profiles are here. There is the experienced fishermen, who are from the area and the oldest, the vacationers, which are really numerous in the area, the neo-littoral, which represent people who arrive in the area to settle, but come from other countries and other regions. And there is the local active, so it's the youngest fishermen who are learning to fish and try to maximize their caught, more or less. So all of these profiles differ both on fishing strategies, favorite fishing season, motivation, but also their impact on the social ecosystems. So we can have some prioritization about what profile, what type of fishermen to follow, but also to work with to reach the sustainability or to have a better fishing condition for everyone, I would say. And the thing that is really interesting is that all that profile are not mixed, but are more or less localized all along the coast. So for example, the Northern Sea is really frequented only or mainly by neo-littoral that we can't find anymore on the south. And on the contrary, the southern cities are very dedicated, for example, to vacationers, to boaters. So it's very interesting because to implement some awareness raising action, but also to make some control, you could prioritize also some area or some spots to make this control and this operation of awareness raising. So all that work lead us to create a new methodology of analysis applicable on each marine protected areas to follow the recreational fishermen. And also, more than this survey method, also a calendar of action that could be deployed inside the park to make awareness raising and also to make controls to be sure that we can have the best activities as possible in the area. Another result, which is really interesting on a scientific point of view, when we speak about indication, is that the composition of the population will influence the yield, so the fishing indicators, but not for all the species, only for a certain list of species. So that will means so that if we would like to use recreational fishing to evaluate the state of stock, it's possible. But for a certain list of species, you have also to include in your analysis some socio-ecological parameters. You need to implement the composition of the population inside the evaluation of the stock, or you can have some misunderstanding, misevaluation of the stocks. And it's only for less than 10 species, which is really interesting because it was never described before. And it sustains the importance of linking the different components, social and ecological, when you work on that practices. So this thesis, well, I end this thesis in December 2021, and it had 3 direct inputs, interesting inputs. So the first one was a direct social output, The first one was a direct social output because 2 months ago, we had the chance that the measure of management measure that we described on the thesis, on part of them, were officially adopted in the Natural Marine Park of the Gulf of Lion. So because thanks to the data we sample and thanks to the work of that thesis, the Natural Marine Park of the Gulf of Lion is today, a pioneer seat regarding the management of recreational fishing, which is really interesting because for that time, political followed the things that we discovered in the thesis. The other output, which is really interesting, was the scientific output, because thanks to that thesis, I had the chance to develop lots of projects and collaboration, and that are still undergoing today, especially on the development of new recreational fishing monitoring protocols, especially analyzing the reliability of declarative data, for example. but also the development of new survey methods that mixing different approaches. Because I am involved today in one thesis and one other project. So one thesis on the connectivity and marine protected areas network improvement, and one project more about how to mix the declaration of fishermen with other technical type of surveys, like acoustic camera, to better describe the fluxes of fish between the lagunas and the sea in the Mediterranean Sea. So it's quite interesting because it makes me broaden also my knowledge and my work. And I also the chance, thanks to that thesis, to be invited in a physics committee in Lebanon, because in Lebanon there is the first assessment of recreational fishing. And it's super important today because of the social crisis in the Lebanon. There is more and more people who are fishing for eating. And the problem is all that fishermen who are dependent to the resource are today considered, regarding the description of recreational fishing, the definition of recreational fishing, as recreational fishermen. So they enter directly in the scope of recreational fishing. That work, the last output of that work is also that it let me have a first postdoc. So I did the first postdoc also in the Natural Marine Park of the Gulf of Lion, with the goal, I told you, to compare the catches, but also the use of the space between small-scale fisheries and recreational fishermen. So it was a work sustained by both professional and recreational fishermen. And the ideas behind was to compare the catches and the use of space to find a way to commonly manage the two activities. So basically, we create a way to manage recreational fishermen. There is already a way to manage professional fishermen, but how we can just mix the two approaches to have something in common if necessary, because there is still the question, does we need to manage it commonly, or are they too different and we don't have to manage it commonly? We have to answer to that questions. So this work, I did a report in 2022 about that work, and it was also used this year to support the extension of the marine reserve of Cervin-Banyuls, which is one of the oldest marine reserves in the Mediterranean Sea today, with a goal at the end to reach the development of the concerted marine spatial planning plan, a concerted, I would say, a concerted management between all the activities. So the result of that first phase of postdoc was that in that area, recreational fishing represents 4% of the total fishing catches. But the thing that is really interesting in that site is that we can't really speak about cumulative impact regarding fishing inside the area, because in fact, all the impact of recreational fisheries and professional fisheries are a little bit spread out all the trophic chain, and not on the same species, or for the same species, not on the same size of individuals. So it's very interesting, because by implemented regulation, you have to be really careful with minimum, maximum catch size and so on, to be sure that we don't push to the conflicts by narrowing the window of species, or narrowing the size that they can both coat both recreational and professional fishermen. Because if we do that, we can create some conflicts, but we could also really destabilize the trophic chain. So it's very complicated, the interconnection between all the fishing activities, and it was really barely described, this thing. We can nevertheless find some species where the size and the catch are common, and so these species could be commonly managed, and some of these species are basically some species from Sparis family, especially the gilded sea bream, which is one of the most caught species in the Mediterranean Sea. Regarding, I told you the layers of space, we analyze the conflicts between the activities, and at the end, we only find one spot, the spot with the fish, where there is a conflict for resources. All the other conflicts are for space. So that result supports the result that we have on catch analysis, that the activities interconnect and not cumulate. And that means that it's more regulating the space and managing them separately than managing them commonly, which is quite new and very interesting in that area. The second dimension of that postdoc, it was that all the work I've done before on fisheries for 5 years was included in the most broad project, which was predict fishing. So basically, if you look on this pyramid of maps on the left side, the work that I did for 5 years represents the two first layers on that pyramid of layers. So the second step, the second dimension of the postdoc was to participate to the creation of a marine spatial model of each human activity inside the Natural Marine Park of the Gulf of Lion. So it is a project done by PhD students from the CRIOB, and I participate to that project. And we add to that project the fishing dimension, which was super important in the area. So basically, when we have a layer for all the pressure, you can have an idea about how your area works and begin to think about how to commonly manage all the spaces and find priorities of management between the activities to be sure to manage with your little mean as well as possible the area. So this is the project behind. And all the work I've done during my PhD and my thesis will help to explain the results of that models at the end. So all the work we have done will lead us to have a complete map of the area, a complete understanding of how the different human activities interact in the area. And the thing that we have still to take into account is the driver of change. Because all the things that we worked before was at the end a description of a static way of things. So the activity is considered more or less static. But with including, for example, the driver of change such as climate, how does this activity change? How does the species move in the area? We don't know. So the last challenge for this development of marine spatial planning models will be to include the driver of change. So this is a thing that we don't do in France in my laboratory. So I have the super chance to come here in Ismar and to work with Elena Gissi and Alessandra Conversi to begin to work on climate change. So the work I'm doing here was to describe how the different pressure, how the different driver of change from climate change, such as sea level rise, temperature warming, and so on, will influence the species and how the species will react faced to these different drivers. So this is a thing really interesting because it needs to reflect about how to integrating climate in the different marine spatial planning tools. So basically the thing that we developed before. How to identify the criteria and the trait of species that make the species sensitive or adaptive faced to climate change. And we can also do that work for human activities because it's the same work behind. So we can also do that for fisheries later. How to analyze the vulnerability of this species faced to climate change or of the activities. So does the activities of the species will be influenced by climate change? And we try to hierarchize the answer of the different species faced to different stresses. So it's a thing really interesting because all the work that we try to develop here will be the things that will explain the future of the activities of the species that we take into account in the marine spatial planning models. So at the end, it's also created some vulnerability maps, so some new layers. They will point out the area where there will be change or the area where we don't expect change. So basically, it will say where the regulation that we create before will stay good in time, and where, on the contrary, we have to expect changes and to expect that we need to rethink the thing of managing how we will manage this area. So basically, it's a work. So at the end, the idea was to add that driver change to the work that we already done on marine spatial planning. And we can also expert the methodology that we are creating on different test sites. And for the moment, I would like to implement the methodology I'm learning here on fishery science, but we can also work on different areas, such as, for example, the island, was very similar problematics and very complex socio-ecological problematics. The offshore area, which represent the area of the future, because with the development of marine protected areas, we are going further and further in the offshore area. And also including other human activities, such as, for example, aquaculture, because we are developing aquaculture everywhere in the world, and aquaculture is really, really a subject which is sensitive to climate change. So I hope that everything that I have done interests you. The presentation that I have done will be of interest to you, and I'm available if you have any questions. So thank you for paying attention.
Hi, thank you, Eleanor. So this was Eleanor Cambra, who is working at CNR Lerici on MSP for Bio, who came from the University of Perpignan in France. So now we're ready to get to the questions.